Thank you.
Hi everyone. Can't even talk, still getting used to presenting online. It's only been a year and a half. Hopefully you're all doing well. I want to begin by coming from a place of care and recognizing the fact that, as we were talking about before, we are still in the in-between times. We're still in the middle or perhaps on the outset of the pandemic. So hopefully you and those around you are well. Hopefully you're taking time for mental care. And hopefully you're taking time for a little bit of physical care or self-care, and hopefully all is right in your world. My name is Ian O'Byrne. I am an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education here at the College of Charleston. I do work in literacy education. I do work with technology and think about hybrid and blended spaces. What I'm going to do is share a little bit of some recent work thinking about computational thinking and trying to explain what we mean by computational thinking, give us a little bit of context for what this might mean. The hope is to provide a little bit of interactivity and a little bit of discussion. More of you and less of me is always a good thing. So we can play this any way that works best for all of you. But basically I have a slide deck that I shared in the chat. I shared the slide deck out through the social channels as well, and I'll show some of that. And I'll share this recording, but then also some of the feedback from this session up on my blog as a way to stay in touch, because I'm sure I'll say some things today that don't quite make sense, and we can come back to it and circle around and see what it means. So to get started, could I get people to either in the chat or unmute and just explain who you are, where you're from, why you're here?
I'll start, Ian. I'm Roxanne DeLaurel. I'm a professor of business law at the college, and I want anything that can help me understand algorithms and their power. I'm there. I'm participating in TLT a lot this year, even speaking, thanks to Mindy strong-arming me tomorrow, but looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you, Roxanne. Algorithms are, and I write a lot about this in my weekly newsletter, but algorithms for me, especially in law, there's a lot of big questions about just technology and IP and other stuff in relation to the law. You know, we have questions about fair use. We have huge questions and discussions about freedom of speech now. So it's interesting seeing the law try to make sense of what's happening with technology. I also am I'm in a series of training modules with a future privacy forum, which might also be in line with some of your questions as we think about privacy, security, what data is collected, what data is not hoovered up by these companies. Right. And because we know, you know, the algorithms are out there and they're gobbling up and quadrupling down on our signals and trying to use those to sell us ads. So we have very large, very real questions that we should be asking.
Yeah, good. I'm looking forward to hearing your opinion on the Google source code, fair use of 11,000 lines of code and all that good stuff. So thank you.
No worries. I'd love to explore more of these questions with you. Benjamin, how you doing?
Hello, Ian. It's nice to meet you. I'm Ben Dean, and I happen to be an attorney too. I confess that. But I'm over at the Citadel in the Baker School of Business.
Yep.
I teach business law, employment law, human resource management. I have the certifications there. I think there's probably a pretty good connection between what you're about to talk about in data analytics, which touches pretty much all of the different areas as we're headed in that direction, at least in the School of Business. So I come as a rank beginner in anything computational.
Yep.
So I'm looking forward to learning from you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Ben. In this talk, we'll definitely dive into deeper areas of data analytics, data privacy, and stuff like that. Most of the focus in this talk will be at the very surface level, because I think it's important for us to make sense of what these components mean, and then what they might mean for us. I always try to make it, there's the old elementary or middle school teacher in me that says, like, connect it to yourself and connect it to the world. So if we can connect it to ourselves, our own lives, or connect it to our fields or our content areas, we can get a better sense of what these different areas are and what their affordances are. Some of the work that we'll talk about is work that is being undertaken by some of your colleagues at the Citadel. So that will pop up here, and I'm sure that their ears are perking up right now. But thank you for joining us. Jennifer Marshall, I saw you texted in there. You're all over this: data coordination, advising, planning, assessment. Any other stuff in the weeds that you want to talk about, or no? Jen's like, no, I typed it. That's why I didn't want to talk about it here on the camera. So thank you. Once again, some of my recent work, I'm being trained from the Future Privacy Forum to think more about student data, specifically K-12, and all of the rules and regulations from a legal standpoint and an organizational standpoint in terms of data, but have not taken, I'll slowly get into what this means for our classrooms. The reason why I do that is I teach teachers, and I work with colleagues at CFC. I've been a distance ed mentor for a little bit. And I think that we need to have more discussion about what privacy and security and these other components mean. Some of that we'll talk about in a session tomorrow I have about intersectionality. Thank you for joining us today. I will modify the session just so that if there's questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Feel free to unmute, yell blasphemy at any point. It's more fun if we just have dialogue about some of these components. So I'm going to go over and share my screen, and we'll jump right into this. So I have a Google slide deck, but one of the things that I also share out is I am on Twitter. And so one of the things I advocate for is being digitally literate scholars. So I've already shared out this slide deck, and we can see that 2 people have already liked this. I just like my own. That's inappropriate. So I share it out on Twitter. I'm on Mastodon, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So I already shared out the link to these. And then at some point today, this will also go up on my blog. I blog about pretty much everything that I do in my classes or my research, and share out those materials. And then lastly, I referenced, and I'll bring this up again at the end, I write a weekly newsletter about technology. And so I try to unpack a lot of the nuance of these discussions. So what we were talking about before, those bigger questions about freedom of speech or law or privacy or IP, I'm regularly trying to make sense of those discussions in my weekly newsletter. But to get started, what I'm going to do is, let me go to, we'll just keep it here. Let me go to full screen, and hopefully, is that showing up full screen appropriately on all of your screens out there?
Yes, it is.
All right, sounds good. So I begin with a tweetable summary. Basically, we're going to focus on computational thinking today, CT. It, for me, is a problem-solving behavior. It is a way to think algorithmically as we make sense of data sets, ill-formed problems. It's not really, for me, a need to think about chat. It's not really a need. It's not really, I'm saying chat as I open up the chat. It's not a need to think about coding or programming. Sometimes when we think about computational thinking, there is this mindset like we want to make all the world into coders. That's not it. It's the thought processes involved as we solve problems and how to make those steps a little bit more discrete And so we can think algorithmically so we can make sense of those problems. I put this in for my classes this semester. I shared it just because this is TLTCon and we have to make sense of what we do in teaching and learning online. I also share this out in my Zoom classes as well, my Zoom keynotes. Feel free to borrow those. My slides are already up on Google. And then lastly, here's some of my Zoom settings because I'll regularly give keynotes. And it's a way to sort of like help scaffold people as they're online. As I said before, my name is Ian O'Byrne. I'm here in Teacher Ed at the College of Charleston. I shared a little bit about my blog and my social spaces earlier. We already talked a little bit about who we are and what our interests, what are our interests in coming to the session. So I'll move on from this slide. Some of the work that I will share today comes from an NSF-funded research program that was awarded to the Citadel and NC State. This is the Infusing Computing Professional Development Series. This is a 3-year, right now we're in a no-cost extension, so it is a 4-year NSF program. The idea here is to make sense of what is computational thinking and embed that, infuse it, if you will, into middle school and high school classrooms in North and South Carolina. So make sense of what is CT and then try to embed that in those classrooms in North and South Carolina and then have them teach it to their students. The final year, the no cost year, will be this summer. It'll be virtual again. We were virtual last year. And basically it's very successful in making sense of what is CT and how can we do a better job embedding it into K-12 education. There is a large vacuum in K-12. There's also a large vacuum in higher ed as we embed CT. So some of the names that you'll see down here are colleagues and friends of mine from the Citadel and NC State. They are the real brains behind the operation. I basically can just click slides and talk. And so that's why I'm here sharing. In the PD experience, one of the things we want to pay attention to is that we view the interaction with CT as being 3 parts. So there is a specific code part of this. So one of the things that we wonder about is, do you need to have people play with code to really understand or grok code? So can we talk about code or coding in the ether, or do you have to have a generally good understanding of what coding is? So back to Jennifer's question, or to Ben's question, do you need to have a couple PD classes or experiences like this and do some general teaching about code and have people play with code so that people that are in law, as an example, can start to really understand what these digital spaces mean and then have them go practice and think about those spaces. So part of our PD is focused around code, where teachers are messing around with a version of Scratch called Snap, and they're basically messing around with code, debugging code. A part of this is the create session, where people are actively building teaching materials and they're thinking about embedding code or computational thinking into their classroom. So they're building those materials. And the last part is most of what this section today is all about, which is the connecting session, which is connecting CT to your life, to your discipline, to your content area, and trying to make sense of what this means to you. So when we think about CT, computational thinking, there are a lot of areas that this is currently showing up in our lives. So there are different standards that are out there. There are different areas that highlight this. In my world, in teacher ed, Google obviously has some literature out there about CT, K12cs.org, ISTE, CSTA, Computer Science Teachers Association has some frameworks out there, but they're all different variants on some of the same idea. So that is to say that when we think about CT, there's going to be a lot of disagreement as to what this means. And we think about CT in our lives, or CT in education, or CT in larger programs. There's going to be a lot of discussions about what this means to us. one of the key things for me is that computational thinking is a problem-solving behavior. It is a way to think algorithmically about data and about situations and come to the best resolution with that data set. So it is a mindset. It is possible, and it's probably better to start thinking about CT without using technology, without getting in front of a computer, without getting in front of code. As a reminder, in the last slide, I showed the code, connect, create. We're taking those two lenses out. So I'm not having you play with code today. I'm having you just think about your lives, think about your discipline, think about your subject area and how CT might connect to those. As I said, it's probably better to start thinking about this, in my humble opinion, without really messing around with code. I think that there is a need to get into the code and think about digitally literate spaces. But I think that we can have these discussions without really unpacking or playing with code at this point. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that this is a challenge because many of us come to this point without a lot of experience in K-12 with CT or with coding or programming. There is minimal support in K-12 education right now. There is minimal support in higher ed environments thinking about what does CT or what does coding or programming mean for these spaces. So our definition in the countless publications that we have, our definition of CT is CT allows us to take a complex problem, understand what the problem is, and develop possible solutions. You can quickly see that this is nothing new. This is nothing surprising. There's nothing new under the sun. What is the challenge is what we do with that. So in my earlier years, I was a researcher looking at online reading comprehension. I helped Mozilla develop the web literacy frameworks. And the idea here is that the internet is changing the way that we read, write, communicate, socialize, connect. And so there's nothing really new happening. It's just the ways in which we interact that is changing for us. So the idea here is when we come across a problem, when we come across a complex problem, how do we understand what is the root of that problem? What do we need to pay attention to? What do we need to ignore? And then how can we solve that problem? And then how can we share that solution to others so that they can solve the problem as well? Also, when we go to solve the problem, we're not going to get the right solution the first time all the time. So how do we make sense of those mistakes and fix those problems or debug the problem so that we can really understand what the root of the problem was? So in other words, let me go back one. In other words, we're taking that and we're breaking the problem down into small manageable parts. We're decomposing that problem. Those smaller parts we can look at to make sense of the different patterns involved in it. And then we focus on the important stuff and ignore the less important extraneous information. And that's called abstraction. And then lastly, we get to that algorithmic part where we think about what are the steps of the rules that are required to solve those problems that are given to us. So let's take a look at this in action. As we watch this, a couple things to note. Yes, the way they explain this is very simplistic. Yes, the way they explain this is, some of my colleagues will say kiddish, but I think that that's important because it provides an approach point for us. Sometimes when we talk about technology, when we talk about computational thinking, when we talk about digital spaces, a lot of times we use terminology that is off-putting or it excludes others. And I think it's important for us to think about meaningful spaces, tools, places that make it a little bit more approachable and a little bit more accessible. Also, you'll see some terminology used in here like pattern recognition, abstraction, algorithms. We'll unpack that, but I want you to pay attention to that in the video series. And last but not least, one of the ways that they introduce CT in this is basically it fringes on what is known as CS Unplugged, or teaching computer science without the use of technology, of a coding environment. That's really the way that I prefer to teach CT or CS. is to do it unplugged, which is get the computers out of the room and start teaching some of the concepts with just people out in the real world in spaces. So what you're going to see here is something that I've done in my classes at CFC. It's something I do in FYE environments or professional development environments, is get people to get up out of their seats and move around. And it's something that we would be doing today if we were in crazy, bizarre Zoom land. So I will stop talking and let this video explain everything. Is audio working for everybody?
Yes, we can hear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All big problems are tiny problems stuck together. So today we're going to get started with something called computational thinking. When we say computer science is more about ideas than technology, what we actually talk about is human thinking skills, the practices, perspectives, and concepts we humans use to structure problems in a way that a computer can solve them. This is what computational thinking is all about. Computational thinking is something that people do, and it includes the ability to think logically, algorithmically, break problems apart and spot patterns. When you are playing music, solving an equation, or making crafts, you are using your computational thinking skills. Computational thinking doesn't have an exact definition. Sometimes the list includes things like automation, data, analysis, parallelization, and simulation. In this episode, we're not looking for a perfect definition, but rather trying to help you see how to connect computer science to the things in the real world, as well as enrich your computer science teaching and learning. Computational thinking doesn't need to replace anything in your classroom. It doesn't require any additional gadgets or gizmos, and odds are you're actually already using it in your curriculum. It's the perfect way to get started teaching computer science. Computers, even though they seem smart, are actually kind of dumb. They follow instructions given to them. So today we're going to practice computational thinking with an activity where we will be teaching the computer to brush its teeth. So the task here is to instruct the computer to brush its teeth. The other student is the computer, the other the programmer. Let's see how things go. So which one is the programmer, which one is the computer?
I'm the computer.
Yeah. Okay, so you're the programmer. What is your first command?
Take the brush.
How do you define the brush?
Take the brush from the cup.
Yeah, and what kind of a brush?
Take the yellow brush
Yes.
from the cup.
Good. And girls, you can get started too.
Okay.
And what happens then? What's the next step?
Take the yellow brush up. Stop. No. Take it down. Stop.
Good. What happens next?
Take the yellow brush to your mouth. Stop. Now try it up. Take a bit down. Stop. And now put it.
What happens next?
Start to brush your teeth.
Good.
Okay,
you're stuck
put
there.
it. It's like a rectangle. Now stop.
Do you need to open your mouth? Could you give him a command?
Open your mouth.
Good.
As well. Now brush your teeth.
Yes, he's a good computer. What's happening here?
Now take the white toothbrush from your mouth.
Beautiful. That was really excellent job, you guys. But you know what? You forgot the toothpaste. Uh-oh. Through exercises like this, we learn how important being precise and defining things well is, and how hard it is to take into account all the situations a computer might run into. We also learn about working together, a trait so important in programming it has a special word, pair programming. The children learned about dealing with failure, debugging we call it, when you look carefully through the code you've written and use logical reasoning to explain where the error is. And very importantly, they learned that programming is very creative. There is no one way to solve the problem. What else? Well, they went through 4 of the computational thinking concepts we are going to be focusing on today. First, we broke the task into pieces. We spotted similarities, things that belong together. We tried to come up with a name to describe these things, and finally we made a step-by-step instruction on how to brush your teeth. We'll start with decomposition, which is breaking a problem into parts or steps. This is something students do every day. They analyze a story, work on math problems, plan the route to the school. In programming, code is often broken into chunks of code you can refer to. Decomposition is important because it allows several people to work together on a team and makes the code more easy to update. So in the very beginning, the kids needed to figure out the different parts of the problem of brushing your teeth. Toothbrush, toothpaste, water, brushing, spitting, movement, and look at each one again through the eyes of the computer. The next thing we'll talk about is pattern recognition, things that are similar to one another. Recognizing and reusing patterns is something we do in our everyday lives, whether it's when we learn a new language, look at a piece of music, or study the patterns in economics. After a little time coding, you will recognize that you keep writing similar blocks of code time and time again. These common solutions to common problems help keep your code structured and easy to work with. Even though these pastries all look different, the ingredients are similar. Finally, let's talk about abstraction. It's at the heart of computer science, and it's all about capturing the important structure of a system or a problem, but not worrying too much about the details. It's the ability to generalize patterns and trends into rules, principles, and insights. A map is an abstraction of the real world. It can't be too vague, but can't show every little rock on the ground. Chemistry abstracts the properties of chemical bonding so that we can have a discussion about it. In math, we abstract or generalize formulas when we use variables instead of numbers, like y equals x2. Imagine we wanted to change the color of the toothbrush. Instead of going to 7 different places in the code, we can just fix it at one place. That's a good abstraction. And this brings us to algorithms. We'll talk about algorithms in more detail later, but at the end of the activity, the children actually did create their very first algorithms. A sequence of instructions or a set of rules to get something done. Algorithms, unlike programs, are written for humans to read. What is computational thinking and what does it mean to teach it? Seymour Pappert's talking about introducing tools to think with, and Jeanette Wing is talking about understanding problem solving with computers, but I think they are both referring to the same thing, finding the aspects of computer science that are simultaneously personal and universal, making computer science approachable and lowering the barrier of entry. Computational thinking is something that will help you and your students to start to recognize how computer science skills apply to other domains and how you can sneak in thinking around computer science into arts, physical education, English, and math. Computational thinking gives an understanding of the artificial world, but it also gives a new way of understanding the natural world.
Dear Linda, what is code and how do you learn programming?
So a couple things to pick up on there. I do that same sort of CS Unplugged activity with students in my classes. I don't have them brush their teeth, even pre-COVID. I do it in classes, in my FYE classes and guest lecture and other classes, first year experience classes here at CFC. I do it in professional development opportunities when I go teach other departments or other schools in higher ed or K-12 school systems. And the easiest way to start talking about computational thinking is an unplugged activity like that. And one of the easiest things to do in your classroom with your students is a simple activity with a ball of paper and a trash can. And so you ball up some paper on the table and you say, okay, I have this paper that's balled up and it's on my table here. There's the trash can on the other part of the room. You are the coder, you are the computer, or you're the programmer, you're the computer. Why don't you give directions to the computer, to that person, to pick up this piece of paper and go put it in the trash? after people fail a couple times, they'll gradually figure it out, and the student will put the piece of paper into the trash can. It's sort of funny, it's endearing in the class, but it makes them understand how there's a need to be crisp, clear, discreet in the terminology. So things like pick up the toothbrush and brush, or walk to the trash can. A computer is relatively dumb. And so in addition, those algorithms that we were asking questions about, the algorithms are just code written by individuals. The algorithm in and of itself, we're not getting into machine learning, we're not getting into AI. The algorithm itself is relatively dumb. It's just a set of steps. It's what we put into the algorithm that is meaningful. So have the class individually do this, maybe come back as a class and look at the rules that people write out, and make sense of what those rules mean. And it's important to make sense of what this might do in our classes. I agree, Roxanne. I love that video. I think that she does one of the best jobs. That series does one of the best jobs at explaining the different components of CT. And that piece is a good intro. It's a little bit long for what I like to do, but I think it's important to take the time and just really understand it. And she's less follically challenged than I am, so that's a good thing. So when we think about the steps, so in the Infusing CT series, we look at this as PRADA. It's just a mnemonic device. You see some of the components. When we talk about PRADA, this is not anything that has to be lockstep in a series of components. It is a mnemonic device to help you remember the key parts. Some people look at this and say, well, first I have to do pattern recognition, then abstraction. No, this is something that could be accomplished iteratively. This is also something that looking at PRADA or looking at these elements, this is something where you could have students study just abstraction or just algorithm to make sense of this. So keep in mind that these are 4 parts of CT. CT can go much more broad. Lately, we're getting more discussion about ethics of CT and ethics of digital literacy. I'd love to talk about that with you. I've written elsewhere and done research in that as well. But for this, we're looking at pattern recognition, abstraction, decomposition, and algorithm, what we were asking about before. So pattern recognition is basically observing and identifying patterns, trends, irregularities, and data processes or problems. Real easy way to think about pattern recognition is with my kids that are, I have a kindergartner and a 5th grader. We play What's the Rule? In our house. And so What's the Rule is a game that can apply to any one of these components here. So if we're all sitting around the table having dinner and my partner and I are wearing a hooded sweatshirt, but my 2 children are not, we would say, okay, what's the rule here at the table? And they would say, okay, mommy and daddy are wearing hooded sweatshirts, but the kids are not. So maybe the adults are wearing it, but the kids are not, or 2 of the 4 people are not. So what are patterns that we can see, and can we identify and make some sort of commentary about what those patterns are? Abstraction is where we look at a problem and we make sense of the general principles or properties. And what's very important here is we identify and we focus on the components of the data, components of the problem that are important and relevant to that problem. At the same time, what abstraction means is that we sort of ignore the unimportant stuff, okay? So we abstract out the stuff that we don't need to pay attention to. So if I'm playing What's the Rule with my kids and all of a sudden they hear a song come on the radio and it doesn't have any bearing on that question, they need to ignore that. If someone else comes in the room and we say, well, what's the rule for the 4 of us at the table? Somebody else comes in, that is extraneous information that we don't need to pay attention to. So abstraction is really getting to the root of a problem. Decomposition is where we take that problem when we break it down to individual parts, to meaningful, smaller, manageable parts. This is very important because in computer science and computational thinking, more specifically computer science, there is this mindset that some of the lower level tasks are easier. So why do we really waste time completing them? You know, why do we want to spend a lot of mental energy counting that there's 2 people out of the 4 people that have hooded sweatshirts? We could just easily solve that little part of the problem and get that out of the way and move on to more important, more challenging parts of the problem. Algorithm is a step-by-step instructional routine, a repertoire to solve that problem, and also similar problems. And so with PRADA, if my advice, my suggestion would be, if you're interested in what these components are and you're working with learners, if you're working with colleagues, if you're trying to figure out what this means in your field, I would start by trying to use the terminology. You know, use the terminology in your field, in your discipline, and figure out what that means for you. So, you know, what does pattern recognition look like in law? What does abstraction look like in student data? What does a decomposition look like in a math classroom? You know, what does an algorithm look like in a phys ed classroom? So I think that's where we begin, is starting to have those discussions. And I'd have those discussions with our students, because part of the challenge, but also the benefit here, is that many of us haven't had this dialogue before, but it's just starting to bring some of these components into our lives. So let's take a look at some of this and unpack it, and you can share with me what your thoughts are, and I'll help calibrate. So when we think about PRADA, we think about pattern recognition. So pattern recognition is observing and identifying patterns, trends, and regularities in data. And the important part here is the part in blue, and it's so that we can repeat common parts. What's very important to a computer is the repeating information. If we're thinking about algorithms, what's important is when you're zombie scrolling through Instagram and you slow up, that is information, and that's relevant information. And so it wants to pay attention to those patterns. And is there a pattern that exists across those? If you're going through Facebook and you're liking all of the pictures of like little babies and cats and stuff like that, and the social network is paying attention to that, and it's paying attention to those patterns, and it wants to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and make sense of those and sell that to others. So my question for you is, what are some examples of pattern recognition that you see in your lives or possibly your content area? What do you think?
Well, Ian, I think for law, it's good to meet you, Ben, even if it is over Zoom, a fellow B-Law professor, and this means you're going to kind of keep me honest. But I mean, this whole pattern recognition in law is, I think it's a really nice fit, actually, what you've described with sort of legal thinking and legal analysis. And you do look for, when you are looking, say, for example, to see if somebody is habitually doing this particular act, and this particular act maybe is always resulting in harm to a particular group, right? You're always looking for the pattern to see what's the outcome of any conduct and what kind of pattern it's leaving. Is it disparately impacting certain groups? So it's a perfect fit, really.
I come from a family of attorneys. And so it's funny when I talk about this stuff. My dad, who was a practicing attorney for a while, now is in health literacy and electronic health records up at NJIT. And so we've done some, not the computational thinking, but the digital literacy, health literacy side of things. And the thing that I've recognized is that, you know, as much as we like to believe that we're highly sentient beings, we operate to pretty much a steady set of patterns, you know, and we can see sort of a rhythm or a cadence to our interactions. And now that we live in a digital space, or an inherently digital space, it's easier to see those digital breadcrumbs and see those patterns writ large.
Right, yeah, this is a perfect fit.
Other ideas for what pattern recognition might look like in your life? Anybody else? So I'm going to move on, but we can keep coming back to this. The next piece is abstraction. So abstraction is looking at that data set, looking at the problem, looking at the situation, and identifying the components that are important and relevant. Here's the super important part here. And it's once again the part that's in blue. And it's important to abstract out the information, which is hide the details that are irrelevant. So you want to look at the data set and say, okay, here's the important stuff, and this stuff here we don't really need to pay attention to. So we're hiding unimportant details to make it easier to understand. So once again, I got a picture of my kids playing Legos and putting together a Lego set. You know, the first one, they're sort of, you could unload all the Legos on the table and you could separate all the different colors that would really harm your ability to put together the Lego puzzle. But if you sort of block things off, you know, now in Legos, they'll give you different bags that are numbered. So it's sort of like saying, okay, don't open all the bags at once, open up part one and then complete part one. And now let's go to part two, open that up and complete that. What might abstraction look like in all of your lives, in your field, in your discipline?
So I think this compares. When I teach project management, for example, you have to sort of, and maybe this is more deconstruction than it is abstraction, but you have to have certain components before you have one full project plan, maybe. So you have to have all the pieces that come together and the planning process and the, I think that's kind of what that is, but I'm not sure.
One of the challenges in doing this is that really whether or not this fits in like pattern recognition or abstraction or decomposition really is in the eye of the beholder. It's what you want to do with the data. So if one of the things we push participants to do is say, okay, well, if I'm looking at project planning and project materials, and I say, okay, I need to understand these parts of the process or understand these parts of the project to, you know, make sure that we're successful or make sure that this area completes their task, then it's abstraction. So you're thinking about those different details and components, and then we're saying, okay, solve these parts of the problem to make it easier to solve the harder parts.
Okay, that totally makes sense. And yeah.
And once again, the thing that I love about sessions like this is the first time through, this is not going to make sense. And I appreciate that, you know, for us, you know, it's important for us to have these discussions and then walk away and say like, okay, I liked Ian or hate Ian or whatever, but I don't really get this PRADA thing. So I'm going to go back to his resources and read some of the pubs that I send out. And then after a while we come back and say, okay, I'm sort of getting it now. The Infusing Computing workshop that Citadel and NC State run that I am thankful to help out with, you know, we have week-long in-depth professional development. And then throughout the year, we keep talking about it. And even then, you know, some of the teachers are still just starting to make sense of it. So Jennifer saying all the data you have to handle has to be broken down into pieces before you can put it back together for assessment. Absolutely. You know, when we're making sense of data, we need to think about privacy and security and making it de-identifiable. But then also, you know, we want to be able to break down the data to their most discrete elements so that we can build it back up into something new to try and make some sense of it. So let's keep moving on. Decomposition. So decomposition is where we'll break down the data, processes or problems into smaller manageable parts. And basically the important part is in blue again, we're using this to break up the problems because human beings, we, for the most part, don't like handling deep, complicated, multifaceted problems. One of the other components is, in our work, we sometimes should focus more on process as opposed to product. In our classes, our students sometimes like to focus on the product and say, hey, here it is, I did my work, leave me alone now, let me have the A, let me move on. Where the opposite would be, let's focus on process and learning gains over time. So decomposition is, let's look at the full problem, let's break it up into individual component parts, let's solve a couple of the easier problems and get those out of the way, and then move on to the more difficult problem. As a reminder, because this is computational thinking and because this has roots in computer science, we want to think about the mindset that at some point a computer could come in and solve those easy problems for us. This is where we start to really see some of the components of algorithms and some of the questionable, my opinion, some of the questionable uses of algorithms. So now we're starting to see algorithms being used for surveillance. We're seeing it used a lot. There's a big debate about Proctorio and cheating software and surveillance software. But now what we're doing is we're saying, okay, here's a bigger problem. Let's look at small data sets and small processes and make sense of it and sort of like solve those and get those out of the way so that you human beings can work on the more difficult problems, or we'll solve a bunch of the little parts and give you the answer and you can put those together to get a bigger part. So once again, decomposition, breaking a big problem up into smaller, more manageable pieces. The Lego set, once again, when we're putting the Lego model together, we're looking back at the box. Where does this go? How does this wing go on the plane? So we're seeing, how do I complete this area of the rudder or the aileron before I move on to the full plane? What might this look like in your life or in your field?
Well, I don't know about in the field. I mean, I guess I can imagine you're maybe a judge trying to decide a case, and you're gonna get rid of irrelevant information like in the previous section and then focus on. But when I see this, I generally think of larger societal issues, like how do you solve our environmental problems? Mm-hmm. And then decompose them into their little bits of plastic, fossil fuel, energy demand, all that kind of thing, and sort of make them, like you said, manageable.
And I think, and I love your example, one of the things that makes me think about is, when we think about big problems, because computer science really wants to just solve big problems. There really is there's no stomach for, as much as I've poo-pooed it so far, there's no stomach for like small, easy problems. They want to get those done and out of the way so we can move on to bigger problems. So with a couple colleagues, we wrote an NSF grant to look at climate change. Charleston area folks, we were in Time Magazine recently talking about climate change. If you haven't seen it, I'll send it around to you. So that is a bigger problem. That is a global problem. That is a wicked problem, as they say in the sciences. And there are multiple layers to that. And so we can try and tease out some of those. Here on campus, we look at our strategic plan and think about where do we want to go in the future of the institution. That is a big problem. That is a big challenge. And there is a need to sort of break it down into multiple little parts while overseeing what those little parts are doing and solve those parts. But also, one way of thinking about decomposition is thinking about little manageable parts. So it could be baking a cake. Okay. It could be cooking dinner for friends. It could be the steps involved in cooking dinner. You're having friends over for dinner and you're making sure that I have these ingredients there at the house. And then I need this much time to get it to happen. And I need this type of wine or whatever it is, but I need these different elements to be the type of environment, the type of event that I want to have at my house. So this is a big problem or a big challenge, and I'm going to break it up into small pieces. My partner works in marketing retail. she is one of the managers at Tory Burch. So knows most of you in the Zoom call will be excited to go name drop and get free swag. But she, her mantra for many things is control your controllables. So what are the things that are in our zone of control or sphere of control? What are the things that are out? And do something about those areas that we can control. And I think that fits in well here, is thinking about decomposition and making sense of those multi-headed, multifaceted problems.
So we do use a whole lot of decomposition in project management because we use something called a work breakdown structure, where we break things out into work packages, and then it makes it easier to assign costs to it. It makes it easier to assign human resources and personnel and other resources to it, as well as, apply formula like earned value management. And anyway, and track all the progress on those work packages. So we do use a lot of decomposition in project management.
And that's one of the things I love about these discussions is with some of these, when we talk about PRADA, some of these will have very clear relationships to our lives or our fields, our disciplines, and others won't really connect as much. And I think that it's just the nature of the field. Law is different than education, is different than the English department, is different than data management. And so each of us have our own knowledge, our own skill bases, and our own dispositions, our own attitudes that we bring to our work. And so some of these will make a lot of sense and be very clear, and some won't be that clear at all. So I think opening discussions like this just helps us become a little bit more aware of what these components are, because then we can walk away and say, I didn't really see an example of decomposition in my world or my life or my field, but now 2 days out, I'm looking at an email or having a discussion with a colleague, and this discussion here is resonating a little bit. We're saying, okay, I can see decomposition in that. So an algorithm. So an algorithm is developing step-by-step instructions for solving a problem and similar problems. If you're thinking about those kids in the video, it's not just telling the programmer, telling the computer what to do, but it's being able to take those instructions and write them down and hand it to someone else. So being very clear, very explicit, very discreet in the instructions to solve a problem and similar problems. And the idea here is that you want reusability and reconstruction. So there is this mindset that your problem in and of itself is not new. It's not novel. We should be able to take your algorithm for a specific problem and use it elsewhere. And that's where some of the challenges arise, as we see an algorithm that we want to just plug into different areas. So once again, I have the Lego step, and we're thinking about logical set of steps to perform tasks in a useful way. What might be an example of an algorithm in your fields, in your life, in your disciplines?
Well, Ian, as you're talking, I'm thinking about supply chain.
Yep.
And, our current problem with gasoline, for example.
Yeah.
Or our previous problems with toilet paper and everything we've experienced over the pandemic. I can see where the supply chain would just be ripe for application of all of these principles, and certainly of an algorithm that would. And what I really appreciate here is that these kids have to explain to each other how to brush their teeth without using any of sort of the human kind of, I don't know how to describe them, but sort of these automatic silent methods of communication that we have, right? We can point, we can shrug, we can get a look on our face. So this type of instruction has to be, as she said, so precise, yet so sort of devoid of humanity. It's got to be so clinical.
Yeah, it's so much fun doing that activity in classes. I guarantee, if you have a class and you're trying to wonder if any of this really makes sense, doing like the paper trash, the paper in the trash can sort of thing, or a small, sometimes in my classroom, we'll have those square tiles on the floor. And what I'll do is, if you want to make it a little bit more challenging, you could have different squares of colored paper and say, okay, let's make a pattern on the floor. So I have a stack of like red colored paper and a stack of green colored paper, and say to one student, okay, I want you to design a pattern and then give directions to that person to spell that pattern out on the floor. It's interesting because that human sort of like wet code that we use to get through the day doesn't work.
Right.
And you just say, move it over a little bit. Computer doesn't know what that means. The beautiful thing about our students is, our students will be stubborn in those moments. They will push the agenda and be super stubborn. And you, and as the educator, can be like, yeah, keep pushing. Like that wasn't clear the direction that you were given. So just, keep walking until you walk into the wall, or, put, your whole body into the trash can and stuff like that.
Right.
That stuff doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I love your example about supply chain. I have a couple colleagues that are big into systems thinking. I'm sure that we all have those people in our lives that think about systems and entropy and all that sort of stuff. And that this makes sense to them. They look at things like supply chain. They look at solving this COVID pandemic, or they look at gasoline or supplies or toilet paper, and to them, or climate change. And it's okay, we need to take care of this, we need to take care of that, and then we'll get to this point. So it's setting up, almost building that recipe and sharing it with someone else.
Right.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions as we wrap up?
I just think this is super cool stuff. I think so, and I'm going to try and hook up to your digitally literate newsletter and get digitally literate.
So the last thing for me is, this is not the end of the discussion. I love talking to new people and getting in touch. I've probably said some things that have more broader questions that this brings about. Please stay in touch. Ask me questions at any point. I blog about all of this stuff and then some. So I'm regularly writing and thinking openly online about a lot of random things, thinking about what these things mean for our lives, what these mean for our spaces in which we interact. And then also my weekly newsletter. I think about the news of the week and think about what this means to us. So this last week, I thought about right to repair, which is huge for my law friends here. It should be a huge piece for all of us. Last week, Facebook had the oversight board basically decided not to take away the ban on Trump. So that got a lot of people happy and mad at the same time. The challenges of ubiquitous video in our lives, mental health in teens, best way to teach reading. And basically every week I give an overview of stuff about a lot of different areas. Hopefully fun, hopefully quirky, and make sense of what this digital space means to us. And I'll put this over in the Whova app so we can stay in touch. And then once we get back to normal times, we can meet up for a coffee and a chat and talk about some of this stuff.
That's great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks all. Be safe. I'll see you all, I guess, hopefully in and around campus soon. Ben, you can go tell your colleagues that at some point we ran into each other. I'll send my friends after you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Bye.
Ben. Thanks, Roxanne.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, I guess I got to go put that stuff over there.
Mhm.